Hey folks, Dave Couples here with you again. In this video, we're going to continue our series in burying the post-tribulation pre-wrath rapture. What we're going to do in the video is we are going to show that God's wrath is going to be in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. And of course, when we lay it out for our post-tribulation pre-wrath rapture proponents, according to a King James Bible, if they are going to be honest with themselves, if they're going to be halfway consistent in their theology, they're going to have to do one of two things. They are either going to have to change their name to no longer being post-tribulation pre-wrath, or they are going to have to back up what they believe to be the timing of the rapture of the church to before the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. So what we're going to do is we're going to show that God's wrath is going to be manifest by way of the Antichrist and the Antichrist armies in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. And of course, you're going to get that a little bit in Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 5 and 6. And over there, it's going to be talking about that Assyrian. But of course, as you come through your King James Bible, that Assyrian is going to have prophetic application of that Antichrist in the future 70th week of Daniel. And in Isaiah chapter 10 and verse 5 and 6, it talks about that Assyrian being the rod of God's anger, and the staff in their hand is God's indignation. And so, of course, that's going to be prophetically speaking of that Antichrist being the rod of God's anger and essentially the staff of God's indignation. And so, of course, essentially that Antichrist, a manifestation of the wrath of God prophetically in the future 70th week of Daniel. And, of course, you're going to get that a little bit more in Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5 and 6, where it talks about that Assyrian, prophetically that Antichrist, being sent against a hypocritical nation and against the people of God's wrath. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5 and 6. And of course, when the Antichrist is sent against the people of God's wrath, that is going to be the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. Of course, you get that in Luke chapter 21, verse 20 to 24. There you see the Antichrist and his armies compassing Jerusalem, and the desolation of Jerusalem is nigh. This, of course, is synonymous with the placing of the abomination of desolation in Matthew 24 and Mark 13. And of course, the way you know that event in Luke chapter 21, verse 20 to 24, when the Antichrist and his armies compass Jerusalem and the desolation thereof is nigh, the way you know that is in the middle of the 7-year tribulation is because when you compare it with Daniel chapter 12, verse 1 and verse 7. And in those two verses, you find out that the people of the prophet Daniel, national ethnic Israel, have a time of trouble for a times and a half. Of course, that is 3.5 years. And so, of course, that is prophecy speaking to Luke chapter 21, verse 20 to 24. That is the beginning of Jacob's trouble, Jeremiah chapter 30 and verse 7. This, of course, is all going to line up when that Antichrist breaks that covenant in the midst of the week, in the middle of the 7-year tribulation, Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27. And, of course, you're going to get a little bit more light about that in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 2. There it talks about Jerusalem being trodden down underfoot of the Gentiles for 42 months. Again, 3.5 years. And of course, you get a little bit even more light about it in Zechariah chapter 14, verse 1 and 2. There it calls it the day of the Lord. And there it talks about the Lord gathering all nations together against Jerusalem, the battle, where the houses are going to be rifled, the women are going to be ravished, half the city goes into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off. This is all the middle of the 70th week of Daniel, and this is when that Antichrist, Isaiah 10, verse 5 and 6, the rod of God's anger and the staff of God's indignation is sent against that hypocritical nation, against the people of God's wrath. This is Luke chapter 21, verse 20 to 24. This is the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. And I would like you to notice that in Luke chapter 21, verse 20 to 24, talking about God's wrath being in the middle of the 70th week, I believe it's specifically verse 23, where it says there's going to be wrath upon this people. Not tribulation, as our post-tribulation pre-wrath rapture proponents might hope it to say, but it says wrath. It says wrath is upon this people. And then, of course, in Luke chapter 21, verse 24, it talks about Jerusalem being led forth into captivity into all nations. And, of course, again, you get a little bit of that in Zechariah 14, verse 1 and 2, where it talks about half the city going into captivity. And, of course, you get a little bit more about that in Jeremiah chapter 32 and verse 37. There you have prophecy about how God scatters national ethnic Israel in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel into captivity into all nations. And there in Jeremiah 32 and verse 37, it says there that God scatters them in anger and in fury and in great wrath. That is God's wrath in the middle of the 70th week, scattering national ethnic Israel into all nations, into captivity, into all nations. All right, so of course we're seeing very clearly, very quickly, according to prophecy, according to a King James Bible, that God's wrath is not limited to coming after some made-up imaginary three-quarter mark in the 70th week of Daniel, but the wrath of God very clearly is going to be in the middle. It's going to be in the middle of the future 70th week of Daniel. So again, if our post-tribulation, pre-wrath, rapture opponents are going to be consistent, they're going to be halfway honest with themselves, they're either going to have to change their name or they're going to have to back up the timing of the rapture to before the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. And of course, you get that a little bit more. Just in case our post-tribulation, pre-wrath, rapture opponents, maybe they're coming to the video a little bit late. They might have missed some of this wrath in the middle of the 70th week, according to a King James Bible. So just in case they missed it, we're going to lay it out for them a little bit more. We're not going to let the poor thing go yet. We're going to take them over to Ezekiel chapter 7, and we're going to take them over to Ezekiel chapter 22. Now, of course, in Ezekiel 7, Ezekiel 22, what you're looking at historically is Nebuchadnezzar coming into the land of Israel, him and his armies, and invading it. But, of course, prophetically, it's undeniable that these things are in your King James Bible because the Antichrist and his armies are also going to come into the land of Israel, and they are going to invade it. And so these things are in your King James Bible that you, the Bible believer, in the present day and age in which we live today, the church age, can read and study these things out and gain light about what is going on in the future 70th week of Daniel. So, of course, nobody's denying that Ezekiel 7, Ezekiel 22 historically is having application to Nebuchadnezzar and his armies coming into the land of Israel. But prophetically, these things are undeniable. These things are undeniably laid out for us in the King James Bible, because they are giving us light about things going on in the future 70th week of Daniel. And so, of course, in Ezekiel chapter 7, you come down to verse 12. And Ezekiel chapter 7 and verse 12, you find out that wrath is upon the multitude of the nation of Israel. And then, of course, in Ezekiel chapter 7 and verse 14, you find out that is God's wrath upon the multitude of the nation of Israel. And then, of course, in Ezekiel chapter 7, I believe it's verse 19, it talks about it being the day of the wrath of the Lord. And so, again, historically, that might have application in Nebuchadnezzar coming into the land of Israel in the past. But prophetically, this day of the wrath of the Lord is going to be applying to that Antichrist and the Antichrist armies in the middle of the future 70th week of Daniel. Zechariah 14 verse 1 and 2 called it the day of the Lord. Ezekiel chapter 7 and verse 19 called it the day of the wrath of the Lord. When wrath is upon this people, Luke chapter 21 verse 23, when the Antichrist, the rod of God's anger, the staff of God's indignation, is sent against that hypocritical nation, against the people of God's wrath. Isaiah chapter 10 verse 5 and 6. This is when God scatters national ethnic Israel in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel in anger and in fury and in great wrath. This is the day of the wrath of the Lord. Ezekiel chapter 7 and verse 19. And again, of course, you get it, as I said, in Ezekiel chapter 22. Ezekiel chapter 22, you go to verse 21, and there it talks about the Lord blowing upon national ethnic Israel in the fire of his wrath. And then in Ezekiel chapter 22 and verse 31, it talks about him melting them again in the fire of his wrath. So, of course, there's no doubt about it. God's wrath is all over the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. This is when the rod of God's anger, the staff of God's indignation, is sent against the people of God's wrath. Isaiah chapter 10, verse 5 and 6. This is when wrath will be upon this people. Luke chapter 21, verse 23. When God scatters national ethnic Israel in anger and in fury and in great wrath. Jeremiah chapter 32 and verse 37. This is when wrath is upon the multitude of national ethnic Israel. Ezekiel chapter 7, verse 12 and verse 14. This is the day of the wrath of the Lord. Ezekiel chapter 7 and verse 19. When God will blow upon national ethnic Israel in the fire of his wrath and melt them in the fire of his wrath. Ezekiel chapter 22, verse 21 and verse 31. And so again, if our post-tribulation, pre-wrath, rapture proponents are going to be consistent, they're going to be halfway honest with themselves, they're going to have to back up the timing of the rapture in the future 70th week of Daniel to before the middle of the 70th week. Because clearly we have demonstrated, according to a King James Bible in this video, that God's wrath is not limited to some made-up imaginary last quarter of the 70th week of Daniel, but God's wrath most certainly, according to a King James Bible, is going to be in the middle. It's going to be in the middle of the 70th week. And of course, our poor post-tribulation, pre-wrath rapture proponents, they've already broken their necks on the timing of the rapture of the church. They have attempted to put it into the 70th week of Daniel. So inevitably, many of them have become subscribers to replacement theology. And so not only are they busy trying to steal the blessings that national ethnic Israel has coming to them in the future, but they are also busy trying to steal the cursings that national ethnic Israel has coming to them in the future. And what I mean by that is when they study out the book of Revelation, when they study out things about the 70th week, the Olivet Discourse, they don't want to acknowledge that national ethnic Israel has a place in the future. They want to try to kick them out of the picture, kick them off the stage, and make it all about themselves, make it all about the church. And so by doing that, they have broken their necks all over the King James Bible. They have missed certain prophecies that clearly contradict their theology. And of course, the Lord set that King James Bible up just so that if you are trying to disconnect national ethnic Israel from having a place in future prophecy, you are not going to have the superior understanding in eschatology. You are not going to come out right. You are not going to have the light the Lord wants you to have about end time events. And so, of course, not only have many of them become subscribers to replacement theology, but many of them, on top of that, have even become subscribers to partial preterism. Partial preterism, probably a matter of time till they bury themselves in full preterism. It's very sad. And so what they attempt to do is these prophecies concerning national ethnic Israel, even the 70th week of Daniel, in Daniel chapter 9 and verse 27, they try to put all these things as having been fulfilled in the past. And again, this is all done in an attempt to try to get rid of national ethnic Israel having a place in future prophecy. And so it's very sad what they do and how they break their neck all over that King James Bible and trying to hold to this made-up imaginary post-tribulation, pre-wrath rapture. So again, what we've done in the video essentially, these are some verses that hopefully you can write down and you can share with your post-tribulation, pre-wrath friends. God's wrath does not only come after some 3-quarter mark in the 70th week of Daniel, but God's wrath also clearly, certainly, undeniably, according to a King James Bible, is going to be in the middle of the 70th week. And so if post-tribulation, pre-wrath theology is going to insist that their rapture comes before the wrath of God, and yet they're going to try to make it happen approximately 3 quarters into the 70th week, well, they're either going to have to change their name or they're going to have to back the timing of that rapture up to before the middle of the 70th week, because again, what we've showed is that God's wrath is in the middle. It's in the middle of the 70th week of Daniel. So this has just been a little bit more about burying post-tribulation, pre-wrath rapture theology and putting it to bed, with a shovel. And so I thank you for watching, and we'll catch you the next time, the good Lord willing. God bless.